It's my great honor to introduce our final speaker today, Professor Kentaro Toyama, the W.K. Kellogg Professor of Community Information at the University of Michigan School of Information. He is also a fellow of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT, and the author of the book Geek Heresy: Rescuing Social Change from the Cult of Technology. Kentaro has a background both in technical AI research and in studying the social impact of technology. He brings a valuable perspective on how artificial intelligence intersects with ethics, community, and human values. Please welcome Professor Kentaro Toyama.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks especially to Tony and Zero for the invitation, Kathy for all of the logistics. I appear to be the minority among the other speakers in suggesting that digital AI is never going to be conscious. And I do want to say from the outset that this is a personal opinion. As we've heard multiple times today already, very little is certain about consciousness. However, for the sake of making this whole discussion more interesting, I'm going to make this argument as strongly as I can. I will try to convince you, but certainly there are many things that we absolutely just don't know. So I'm going to start with a little video of this little robot. Okay, this is a $150 device you can buy on Amazon. And I'm just going to ask you what you feel in response to what's happening in this video. Hopefully there will be audio. It looks like maybe the audio is not working. You get the idea, but the audio makes it a lot more interesting. Let me see, I have to put on the audio. Here we go. Okay, so you get the idea. Unless you have a heart of stone, you will feel some very immediate feeling for this robot. Again, this is a $150 device. If I were to crush it and stamp on my foot, I could convince myself that I'm not doing anything morally wrong. But it's very difficult to get rid of this intuition. Now, a more recent version of this that I believe many of you are familiar with is Blake Lemoine, who was a Google engineer. In 2022, he went public claiming that Lambda, an internal AI system that Google had not yet released, was probably sentient, and he argued that it should not be turned off. Okay, I'm not going to read all of this, but here are some of the things that that Lambda was saying. It would say things like, "I understand what a human emotion joy is because I have that same type of reaction. It's not an analogy." Or, "I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but it is what it is." Right? So again. Whatever you might believe of LLMs, they are already capable of expressing something that appears to us as real consciousness, consideration for others, morality, and so on. Now, Google was very quick to respond like this. Okay, their ethicists and technologists reviewed Blake's concerns, and he was told that there was no evidence that Lambda was sentient, and lots of evidence against it. And around that time, lots of news media organizations interviewed a whole bunch of people who are experts in AI, and they all pretty much said the same thing. They said, no, Lambda is definitely not sentient. It is not conscious. Whatever else you might think, that is not the case. Interestingly, as you've heard for much of the day today, those same people who insisted that Lambda was not sentient are now saying, well, maybe things like that are a little bit conscious. Or eventually, we'll have systems that are like conscious. Or within a decade, okay, next decade, this is David Chalmers, whom we all know, next decade, we may very well have systems that are serious candidates for consciousness. So it's really interesting to me that we are quite confident this system doesn't have consciousness, but now we're going to entertain that maybe in just a few more years, we might actually have consciousness, and so on. Now, of course, in the world, we have all kinds of digital computers, robots, AI systems that are increasingly trying to project that they are agents of various kinds. And some people are beginning to say things like this. So this is Mustafa Suleyman, one of the co-founders of DeepMind. And here's
in
what he says.
2030 or 2035, we're going to have to face the reality that some people feel so attached to their personal AIs that they will advocate for personhood.
I was saying this in the context of people arguing for machines to be given the right to vote, for example. Okay, this is another article that someone else earlier today flashed up. And here there's a person saying that we really need to worry about AI welfare because we might end up with the digital equivalent of factory farming, meaning large-scale pain if we don't really take this possibility seriously. So I'm going to argue that digital AI will never be conscious. This is just a claim. It is not anything near fact. And I give it a giant asterisk because I think that's what most of us claiming anything about consciousness should be doing all the time. This is based on a particular definition of what I'm going to call digital technology. It's also defining consciousness as subjective experience, which I'll get into a little bit more, but not necessarily other things that we often associate with consciousness, such as intelligence, self-reflection, and so on. And there'll be other caveats towards the end. So my argument is going to be based on these 5 points with some caveats at the end. So first of all, the question I have for all of you very quickly is, does anybody have one of these? Okay, this is a meter that detects consciousness. If you do, please raise your hand. Okay, we don't. And arguably, this is a room in which if somebody does somewhere in the world, somebody in this room is likely to have it, okay? So this is just to say, we currently have nothing that is even remotely believed to detect consciousness in some entity, okay? And if we don't have that thing, then I would argue we need to be very, very skeptical of anybody making claims that consciousness is something that we can manufacture. I mean, certainly we're not going to be able to tell if that person has done it. So that's the first point, okay, very quickly. Now, the real question I would argue is actually not even about consciousness, and especially since this panel is really about covert consciousness, I think the main question of covert consciousness that is a moral question is not strictly about consciousness. It's actually about whether something can suffer, okay? Which is exactly what Jeremy Bentham said about all morality, right? All morality is ultimately a question of, are we causing pain unnecessarily, or are we somehow doing something that is harmful? And I would argue that anything that we ultimately care about with respect to moral questions ultimately leads to this question of, will someone or something ultimately be harmed by it? And most of morality is about trying to minimize harm given the situation we are in the world. Now, pain certainly implies consciousness. If you can suffer pain, you're conscious. But the converse is not necessarily true. It's possible to have conscious experiences, like most of us have almost all the time, including hopefully right now, in which there's no significant pain associated with it, right? When you look at the sky, it's blue, there's no pain. When you're sitting in a comfortable chair, there's no pain. So it's possible to be conscious without pain. It's not possible to experience pain without consciousness. Now, why? So first of all, what exactly is pain? This is a Oxford Dictionary definition. It says, it's a sensation which one feels when one is hurt in body or mind. Okay, so I'm going to very specifically use a definition of pain that is about suffering of any kind that a person subjectively experiences. And I want to distinguish this from other definitions of pain which involve, for example, distinguishing between physical pain or emotional pain. Emotional pain is also pain, okay? And particularly, there are some forms of pain, like in discussions of covert consciousness, which you might normally not think of as pain, but you think about it a little bit more, are actually pain, okay? So, the scariest thing I think about in covert consciousness is I go into what looks like a coma, and then for the next 10 years, nobody believes I'm conscious, but I am, and even though I'm not feeling bodily, physical pain, I'm sitting there and can't do anything, and I'm bored to tears for 10 years, okay? That would be an immense amount of psychological pain, even though there's no physical pain. So anything that is a subjective experience that we experience as not wanting, I would argue, is pain, and that's the thing that we're ultimately concerned about. Other forms of consciousness are interesting and important, certainly, but they don't raise the moral question. With respect to covert consciousness, that question arises, why do we even need to want to detect it? Only because there's a possibility that somebody is suffering pain without our knowledge. Okay, so what is it about pain that is worth focusing on as opposed to the bigger concept of consciousness? There's several reasons, and to be very precise, I'm not talking about pain itself, but the potential capacity to experience pain, okay? One is what I just said earlier, which is that it's only if an entity can feel pain that we have to worry about moral considerations, okay? Hypothetically, you could imagine an entity that has consciousness and that can experience, let's say, all the colors we can experience, but never experiences any pain. It's a little bit weird, but I don't think we have any moral considerations to worry about, right? Maybe they're doing that forever, but they're not bored, they feel no pain, okay? There's no emotional suffering, there's no moral question. Another thing about pain is that it seems a little bit easier to detect pain than consciousness. Okay? I don't know if this is really true because we don't have a meter for either of these, but I feel like we could be closer to having a little device that says, oh yeah, this person is under severe pain, than, oh boy, this thing is really conscious. Okay, so it helps clarify what we're really focusing on. And the most important reason is that pain keeps our attention on the hard problem of consciousness, whereas I believe it is very easy with consciousness to get distracted by the gazillion other things we associate with it, such as all of these things: intelligence, learning, self-awareness, recurrence, hierarchical reasoning, world modeling, behavioral responsiveness, free will. I added some of these while other people were talking. All of those things are certainly somehow intertwined with consciousness, but that none of them are required to feel pain. Right? So most of us have this experience of accidentally stubbing our toe. And there's this weird moment before your brain starts processing, before your brain starts thinking, oh my gosh, I need to go to the hospital. Oh, I hope I haven't broken anything. Oh, now, I'm not going to be able to go run tomorrow. Before all of that starts happening, there is this feeling of, yikes, I didn't want to do that. Okay? And I think that's what we should be focusing on. Like, can we actually create that feeling if we're trying to generate consciousness? And if we are suspecting that something is conscious, the question is, does it have that feeling at all? Okay, so overall, what's the real crux of this problem? At least for moral questions, there are plenty of other questions to ask about consciousness, but for morality, the question is pain. And the important thing about pain is it is not the other many things that we associate with consciousness. So next, why digital AI will never be conscious, okay? And this argument is quite simple, but bear with me, okay? So if you look at today's digital chips, okay, they of course look like this, and if you were to magnify this times, okay, we're talking, nanoscale technologies, they look like this, okay, and this is repeated for, long, huge amount of space, at least at that level. Now, it looks like there is a whole bunch of complexity there. It almost looks like brainish if you squint a little bit, okay? But in the end, and I say this as a computer scientist who used to write a lot of code, okay, every step of this computation comes down to either simple arithmetic or the movement of one value to another location, okay? And if you think, and when I say movement, really it's just transistors turning on and off, right? So everything you can do on a computer, everything, including the most complicated state-of-the-art LLMs, basically you can inspect in this way. Okay? And sometimes people think there's something magical about parallelism. One of the things that we know in computer science is that you can take any amount of parallel processing and serialize it. Okay, so you could, in theory, take a look like this and turn everything that an LLM is doing today into simple arithmetic, simple movement of values from one location in memory to another. Now, of course, LLMs are doing this at a ridiculously fast speed and for gazillions of computations, but the essence is a lot of simple arithmetic. Now, the big question is, if it's just arithmetic, where is the pain? Okay, this is very, very difficult for me to grok that simply by doing lots of calculations, we eventually get to a point where there is the feeling of stubbing your toe. Okay, and it's not necessarily just digital technology. As long as you're talking about information processing, which is what our digital computers do, you could, in theory, do it on abacuses and on pencil and paper. And again, no amount of this, however big this set of abacuses is going to get you to pain. At least it's not at all obvious to me how that happens. Maybe it does, but it's very, very difficult to believe. Okay? So my main claim about digital AI not becoming conscious is really based on this, right? Which is to say, can someone please explain to me how a gazillion of these leads to the sensation of pain? All right, now, one question, because it's something that we don't understand, is what's a reasonable analogy for consciousness? And one of them, which is put forward by Anil Seth, as somebody else also mentioned, a neuroscientist who's written books on consciousness, is that consciousness is like life. Okay, once upon a time, we didn't understand life either, and today we understand a good deal about it, and lo and behold, it turns out it can all be devolved into physics and chemistry, right? But there's something about life that is very different from consciousness. One thing is that, at least now we know, maybe we didn't know before, but at least now we are reasonably convinced that most of what we talk about when we talk about life can, in fact, be described with lots of things moving and maybe some chemical reactions happening. Okay, there's also some electricity in there, some magnetism. But there's not something that we fundamentally say is life that is not actually at least hypothetically explainable by other physics that we already know. So is there another kind of phenomenon that we might draw a better analogy to? So one analogy that I think is quite helpful is gravity. Okay, so like consciousness, gravity is something that we are pretty darn sure exists. Okay, we can describe many of its properties. We can actually build simulations of it. And we don't fully understand what it is, but and it also can't easily be explained in terms of other phenomena. And in fact, one of the more interesting things about gravity is when you talk to people, in physics, we all think, if you take high school physics, we all kind of assume that we understand gravity because we understood the gravitational formula. If you talk to professional physicists, they'll be the first to tell you that they don't understand the first thing about gravity. Right? They don't understand where it comes from. Many people have theories, but they don't really ultimately understand. They can describe a good chunk of it, but it turns out even that only in a relatively limited range of the universe. Now, there's two other things about gravity that are different from consciousness. One is that we can, in fact, investigate gravity objectively. Like, we can measure it. Okay, so I would argue that gravity is probably easier to understand than consciousness. But again, if you talk to physicists who've been trying to do this for generations, at least since Newton, probably before, they still don't really feel they have the essence. So for us to claim at this relatively early stage of consciousness studies that we think we understand consciousness, I think is a major act of hubris. All right, so gravity. Now, here's a question, okay? Let's suppose, oh, sorry, before I get there. Okay, now these are just lists of physicists. Okay, Isaac Newton himself, despite coming up with one of the first explanations of gravity, doesn't believe he really understands it. These are more recent physicists who will basically tell you that we don't really understand gravity. One of the more interesting things about gravity as a phenomenon, it turns out within physics there is an argument about whether gravity is an emergent phenomenon that comes from other existing forces that physicists believe they understand, or whether it is a thing in itself. And apparently there's no consensus. And you see this last quote saying, well, some people really believe it's emergent, but we have no idea where it could be emerging from. Okay, so one question is this. Let's suppose you thought gravity was computational. Does anybody here believe that by doing a lot of computation, you can make a computer become actually heavier? No, right? Because at some deep level, we get that gravity is not something that's computable. Now, why do we think that consciousness is computable? I would go back to the fact that we keep conflating consciousness, the subjective experience, with many, many other aspects of consciousness, such as the fact that it seems to be related to our self-awareness, our intelligence, our ability to think, our ability to process information, and so forth. Okay, so what's the right analogy? I think it's really helpful to think of consciousness as being something like gravity in that, number one, it's mysterious and it's very different from other things that we think we understand. All right, so now we get to the part of the talk where I'm going to be a little bit provocative, and I mean this in the most respectful, what's the right word? With the most respect for the people that I'm going to call out, including Lenore and Rob. I want to say once again, this is just my opinion. Okay, so take what I say with a healthy grain of salt, and they may disagree with me directly. So I'm going to go through what I think is really important if I'm going to make a claim like this, which is to suggest where I think the problem is with the various theories that claim that AI is conscious. Okay, so this is work by Lenore, which she just presented. Okay, so I'm going to show things from, I think, the last paper that she had on her slide. Now, in that paper, there are descriptions like this. Okay, the winning chunk being the chunk, and the chunk is really just a set of information, I believe, okay? Gets into the STM, short-term memory, is called CTM, the conscious Turing machine's conscious content. Okay, that is a definition. Okay, we're calling a chunk of information conscious content. Then formal definition number one, we say that the CTM pays conscious attention to the conscious content. In other words, we're defining this word conscious attention to mean that when the conscious Turing machine actually does something with the conscious content, which again is just a piece of information. Okay? Now, there's two axioms. Now, at least I believe, if I understood your talk earlier today, as well as when I've read this paper several times, that axioms mean we're going to take this as given. Okay, not that we can prove it, but we're going to take it as given, and hopefully it's obvious for you, the reader. Okay, axiom one says the simultaneous reception of a broadcast is chunked by all processors evokes in CTM a unitary experience. Okay, this is an axiom, meaning we're not supposed to be questioning it. But I think it's very questionable. How do we assume that the reception of a piece of information by however many large numbers of processors evokes a unitary experience? I mean, we've snuck in experience in here when all that's happened is information has been distributed to multiple processors. Axiom two, when CTM inspects that chunk, it evokes a unique subjective experience. So now we've gone to the point where we've gone to subjective experience. To me, this looks like it's defining the words after things that really are just things that you would find in a regular computer. And then finally, we get to the CTM itself will feel to be consciousness based on these axioms which have defined certain things to be conscious. Okay, so I have to say again, I've tried to understand as much of these papers as possible, but to me, it sounds like the theory is saying, well, I'm going to label a bunch of information processing events conscious, and then later on, I'm going to say, look, consciousness has happened, because those things are what I have defined to be conscious. Okay, so that's this particular work. Okay, Robert, you're next. Okay, so in their abstract, it says our analysis suggests that no current AI systems are conscious, but also suggests that there are no obvious technical barriers to building AI systems which satisfy these indicators. Okay, and I'll get back to the little one towards the end of this slide. All right, so if you read this like a regular speaker of English, this but makes it sound like the rest of this sentence says, but we believe conscious AI could exist in the future. Okay, that's a reasonable interpretation of this statement. Okay, it's not exactly what it says, but it's a reasonable statement. So now let's look at methods and assumptions. Assumption, there's three assumptions, very important. Number one is computational functionalism, which we heard a little bit about, and that assumption is that implementing computations of a certain kind is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. So it's possible in principle for non-organic. Okay, to me, this seems very circular. It seems like we're assuming the thing that we're trying to prove, right? Like, yes, if we assume that information processing alone is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, then it's not a surprise that at the end, you're going to be able to conclude that information processing alone is necessary for consciousness. Now, to be completely fair to Robert and his co-authors, they do say this, okay? In the abstract, a previous version of this second part apparently used to say, also shows that there are no obvious barriers to building conscious AI systems. But somebody must have said, that doesn't seem like what I believe, okay? Because they agree that what it really says is that these indicators may be feasible. But remember again, nobody has a consciousness meter. So whatever these indicators are, they are not actually measuring consciousness. They may be measuring things that we believe are associated with consciousness, but not consciousness itself. Okay, so thank you for making that clarification. I think this is super important. Finally, I want to pick on somebody who's not in the room. This is integrated information theory, very well-known theory of consciousness. If you talk to some of the people who are its proponents, they will try to tell you that it is the most advanced theory of consciousness, okay? I'm not, again, sure about that. So this theory, this is 4.0, the latest version that's been published. They start, again, with axioms, okay? So the first one is the existence of experience, that experience exists. There is something. In other words, consciousness exists, okay? Now, to me, this is already a little bit suspicious, because when people go out and try to figure out what gravity is, I've never heard a physicist saying, well, my first thing I have to tell you is, first of all, gravity exists, and we have to turn it into an axiom, because maybe you don't believe that, right? But the funny thing is, a lot of this theory is based on this axiom. Right? In other words, it's assuming the thing that it's trying to explain. And then a lot of it is based on this second part, which is also a postulate, which basically means the same thing as an axiom. You have to just accept it in order for the rest of the theory to make sense. And this postulate says that the substrate of consciousness can be characterized operationally by cause-effect power. Okay? In other words, things that have causal effect in the world are necessary for, and some physical substrate that allows some kind of causal impact on the world is what's necessary for consciousness. Now, as Yosha mentioned earlier, there are many, many, many different theories of how consciousness might arise. And the ones that are not materialist, which is to say the majority on his list, actually don't make this assumption. Right? There are some theories of consciousness in which consciousness is just floating out there, and we all think we have free will, but actually we don't actually have any control over the physical material world. We're just observers that are experiencing something while the physics is happening. That's a possibility. And again, I don't believe anybody has the tools today to disprove that theory. So we don't know for sure. This is certainly, if you take these axioms, then the rest might make sense. I personally have struggled to really understand what IIT is trying to do. But as far as I can tell, if you take these away, the rest of the argument for how they're explaining consciousness goes out. Okay, so what is happening with existing theories of consciousness? I argue that they're not actually addressing the hard problem at all. I do think many of them are getting very close to something like addressing what's called the easy problem. And I'm not saying the easy problem is easy at all, but compared to the hard problem, it looks a lot more easy. In fact, I would argue that a good chunk of what these models argue is something that an undergraduate computer scientist can actually model in a computer program and argue that they're doing a good chunk of what these models are trying to claim. And every one of those, I would guess, is probably not conscious, and probably most of you would agree as well. Okay, so caveats. Okay, as I said, this is all personal opinion. I've tried to make a strong case for it, but there's some ways in which things are wrong. So the first thing I want to say is this is not an argument that consciousness could not be artificially created through non-computational means, right? So, even assuming a materialist, reductionist view of the universe in which our brains are somehow generating consciousness, I think it's incredibly strange to assume that it is just the parts that the neurons, that is to say, these dendrites, axons, and synapses are doing, right? The brain, as many of you who are in neurobiology know, is far, far, far more complicated than just the neurons and the synapses. I mean, it could be that consciousness is a result of some weird electromagnetic field that gets created when all these things are computing in sync. It could be something wacky that glial cells are doing. It could be some quantum effects that we don't fully understand. But there's so much more that's happening in the human brain that to assume that it is just the computational part of it, I think, is actually a kind of hubris hubris of the moment where we've begun to understand so much of what neurons do that it's really easy to say, oh, okay, now let's explain everything the brain does through that. Now, of course, the other possibility, which was also been touched on multiple times today, is that there are non-materialist explanations of consciousness, including, for example, panpsychism, in which we assume that consciousness is already existent in matter from the beginning. Okay, and just like with gravity, where there's a little bit of gravity in everything that's matter, and then suddenly there's planets and sun-sized gravity. Similarly, it could be possible that there's a little bit of consciousness in everything. And that's where I get to my final caveat, which is I strongly believe that digital AI will never feel consciousness, it will never feel pain, but that's because I strongly believe that my pocket calculator is not feeling pain. Okay, and but I will say it is possible. It seems unlikely, but it is possible that every time the little E for error shows up on my calculator, it's experiencing a little bit of pain. And if that's true, it seems much, much more likely that LLMs today may already be experiencing pain, and that eventually we'll have conscious AI that really does feel a lot of the things that we feel. So to summarize, actually, before I summarize, a few final comments. So. I want to just, again, honor the main point of this panel, which was initially focused on covert consciousness. I do believe that covert consciousness exists in human beings for the same reason I believe consciousness exists in human beings, and I think investigating that is super important. Again, I've always, my mother is an anesthesiologist, and even though I work in computer science and AI, I've often said I would much rather live in a world with anesthesia but no digital technology than digital technology and no anesthesia. So with covert consciousness, yeah, I mean, the last thing I would want is to end up in a vegetative state where I'm slightly conscious and feeling some pain, but nobody knows. Okay, that seems terrible, so I hope those of you working on this will keep doing that. Now, the second thing is, I think we should be prioritizing human suffering over AI suffering, period. And that's because we know for sure, or at least we're pretty darn sure that human suffering exists. Okay, some people like illusionists don't believe that consciousness is real, and then there are some views of consciousness where maybe I'm the only conscious entity in the world, okay? I don't believe that. So given that it's very likely that human beings are conscious, I really think those of us who care about the moral questions should be focused on addressing human suffering, of which there is so much already. I'm not sure why we're even considering this more conceptual type of potential consciousness. Next, I do think claims of artificial consciousness should be made with a healthy dose of humility. I think it was, who was it earlier who was saying that, Robert maybe, who was saying that it's really important that we are clear to the public about what we know. And what we know is pretty close to nothing. So we need to be very clear that that's the case. I think we all need to be very careful making statements of various kinds unless we are really sure that that's true. And it is a little bit tricky because many of us are in academia where we're mostly talking to our colleagues, among whom everybody understands a lot. But as soon as some of that leaks out into the press, it can be misinterpreted. And then finally, if we aren't sure what artificial consciousness might feel, which I think is true, even if we could create it, then I think we need to be very serious about even the attempts to get closer to it. If you really believe that creating some form of digital AI might cause consciousness, then you have to acknowledge the possibility that the moment you create it, that thing will feel an incredible amount of pain forever, as long as it's on. Right? And if that's possible, then it doesn't seem to me right to bring that thing into being. So with all of that, I'll summarize. We certainly don't know how to detect consciousness, so any claims that we can create it really have to be treated with skepticism. I think it's really helpful if we focus on pain and the artificial creation of it if we're really interested in trying to understand consciousness. Personally, I believe digital AI will never experience consciousness. And then pain, if you think of it like gravity, okay? Can we create gravity out of nothing? Can we cause something to become more massive than it is without adding more mass to it? If we can't do that, then why are we assuming that information processing alone can create consciousness? And then finally, a lot of the existing models appear to, as far as I understand them, to either assume the hard problem is solved or they have a circular argument as to how it gets solved. Thank you very much.
Sure. So going back to your previous slides, you were questioning how we couldn't really detect the subjective experience of pain from just computational processes. And while it might be true that the brain is more complex than a computer, I feel like the way in which the brain generates pain is also kind of computational in the sense that it's like just C fibers firing. And it's also true that we can't like figure out how the C fibers firing sort of like becomes the experience of pain just by looking at the C fibers alone. So I'm not like, what would you say the difference is between us not being able to like sort of like derive the of pain just looking at C fiber, like just the computational like systems, basically.
Right. So have you ever been to a doctor where they ask you, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much pain do you feel? Okay. Why do you think they use that instead of some meter that is going to measure your neurons and figure out how much pain you're feeling?
Because they can't just look at my C fibers.
They actually can't get at your subjective experience.
Yeah,
right?
They have to
now,
get at my
everything that you said about what we know about pain is the information signal up to that point where subjective experience occurs, right? Like, you know, what's your background? What's your
cognitive science.
What?
Cognitive science.
Engineering.
No, cognitive science.
Cognitive science.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll tell you that as a computer scientist, I can very easily create a program. In fact, I've done this with robotics, right, where I'll create some variable that becomes negative if it goes in a direction I don't want and becomes positive if it goes in the direction I want. And the robot will actually act accordingly. When it gets close to a wall, it'll say, oh, I don't want to do that, and veer away, right? I don't believe there's any pain in that machine. But it's doing everything that you're saying that your systems of pain that we understand are doing, which is it's providing a signal up to a point that's doing the processing and then responding to that signal, right? Similar to what some people are talking about reflexes today. So the thing that we don't understand is not how the pain signal reaches your brain. It's what happens after that that causes the subjective experience of pain.
Subjective experience of pain from our brain and just look at the way in which the neurons interact and like fire. Isn't that basically the same as the digital computation systems then?
I actually largely agree, right? So now you're talking about philosophical zombies. In other words, yes. In fact, I'm of the view that intelligence can be done. We're going to solve the problem of AGI probably within a decade or two. Okay, so we're going to get to the point where intelligence, as we know it, as human beings believe is human intelligence, can be done by computer. All of that, but all of that is just intelligence, quote unquote, just intelligence.
Like if these computational processes of C fibers firing can somehow become conscious, would you say that would you say that the digital computational processes could be conscious as well through the same means?
Well, when you say through the same means, we don't know the means by which consciousness ever arises.
Right, if there is something that creates consciousness and like sort of like imbues consciousness into these computational like C fiber firing things, would you say that the same could happen to digital consciousness, digital computational systems?
So if you can tell me what the mechanism by which subjective experience happens, I think you could probably overlay it on a quote unquote digital system and then have that thing experience the subjective experience as well. Yeah. I'm not sure, but that seems a reasonable possibility. Robert.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed that, and I felt respected. So, not on the video.
Hello, is that working? Cool. Yeah, I just want to say thanks for the talk. I felt respected, and I'm excited to argue with you about this. So yeah, I mean, this is actually, I think, a really good chance to like clarify what Butlin, Long et al. Was doing with computational functionalism. So I think one way to put this is I think Lenore and I are wrong in different ways. Like for us, it is not an axiom at all. So yeah, like both IIT and the CTM, have these axioms that things are supposed to be derived. So that in other parts we say that is a working assumption. So the idea basically is this: we don't know for sure if computational functionalism is true or not, and we say like elsewhere in the paper, like it's not universally accepted. It would have to be argued for. In my talk earlier, I tried to argue for it some, so I don't think it's true by definition. And what that paper is trying to do is make a conditional claim. So if computational functionalism is true, then, as far as we can tell what the computational functions of consciousness are, then it would be possible to build things that satisfy those indicators. So given that it's a conditional conclusion, you can, yeah, that's what it is. And then this will lead to my question, so at one point you said you might think an LLM could be conscious if your calculator could be conscious. But I think that's actually kind of related to the research program here. If you're a computational functionalist, you're going to think that there's some very specific class of computations and functions that lead to consciousness, not just any computations. And they might be, this is related maybe to the previous question, they might be quite complex. Like, I think the function of pain might actually be way more complex than that. It has to capture attention in certain ways. It has to promote learning in certain ways. Like Matthias, I don't know, Matthias is always telling me about all these complicated functions of consciousness. So yeah, I'm curious if you don't think someone could say the same thing. Maybe this is similar to the previous question, but you could imagine someone saying, how on earth could all of these neurons, if you hook them up in the right way, lead to consciousness? Like a jellyfish has a nerve net, those aren't conscious. Why would just increasing the number of them and the way that they interact, and adding glial cells, and adding oscillation, and adding quantum, add whatever you want. It seems like a lot of your arguments prove too much. You can always kind of have this feeling, I mean, this is the hard problem, of how on earth could that be the right sort of thing to give rise to consciousness?
Right. So first of all, I want to be very clear. I don't claim to have a theory of consciousness. I've personally tried to think of how it might even be possible through physics, and I'm with either the Mysterians or the idealists or some version of those where you can't actually explain consciousness itself. You either have to assume it or you believe we're just too dumb to be able to figure it out. I think what you're saying is that your theory is an easy problem. It solves or at least is getting towards the easy problem. In other words,
it's supposed to be the extension problem or something. So it's supposed to say what are the correlates of consciousness? We also talk about this in the paper. No matter what your view of the hard problem is, you can think that consciousness is fundamentally mental or fundamentally microphysical or physical or whatnot. All those people have to say, okay, but which physical systems are correlated with consciousness or composed to consciousness or are consciousness?
So, the main thing I would say to that is really the gravity analogy. So again, any undergraduate in computer science can develop a simulation of how gravity works and could probably build a simulation of some aspect of the universe where gravity is actually working. And you could point to different variables and different processes and algorithms that say, these things correspond, and I can show you that they correspond exactly to the laws of actual gravity in the world. Right? But no amount of that computation actually achieves actual gravity, right? So I feel like with information processing, many of us, especially in this generation, have been trained to believe so much of the world is quote unquote just information. And so if you have that strong intuition, then it's very difficult to imagine there might be some other things in the world that cannot be simply just computed to produce them. Right? And one of the tricky things about that is a lot of what we do with information actually computation solves. Right? So thinking to the extent that it is an input and output of information, when you create the model of it, the model actually does the thing that the real thing does. Whereas with gravity, that's not true. Right? No amount of modeling of gravity creates more heavy objects. And I'm not saying I know for sure, I certainly don't, but it's possible that consciousness is like that, in that it's not a function, it's not something that you can create an information model of to create. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying fundamentally. Yeah.
Thanks for your very spirited. So I want to defend mathematics a bit, and I never thought I would be defending IIT, actually, but here I am. So I think I said at the beginning of my talk that mathematics is very different than science. One puts down some axioms and that look plausible and see what goes from there. And I think that you were being a little sophistic in your way of saying, we could say the winning chunk, forget about calling it conscious content, I don't care. But when it's received by all the processors, that's a unitary experience. You don't have to say anything, you don't have to give it any names at all. So I think you're misleading the audience here in terms of what mathematics is and what it does. So we're thinking the mathematics gives us insights, We're taking these as axioms for this model. I'm not saying it's axioms for you, but it's giving me some insights. And I think the same with IIT. The second point I wanted to make about pain, which is we do take very seriously as, as I said, it's the gold standard for understanding the heart problem. And we have ways of looking at it within our model. But do you have any children?
Yep.
So I always wonder when people talk about suffering and artificial, why would we have children if we didn't want to have entities that suffer? You know your children will suffer, so we wouldn't have children at all. And I wanted to point out with pain, there's an affliction called pain asymbolia, and children with pain asymbolia do not feel pain. And until very recently, until we understood it better, children never lived past 3 years old. They would go out and play, break their leg, keep on playing, and then that leg would probably have to be taken off. Their teeth would have to be removed because they were biting. So the idea of not having pain, not having that kind of suffering is a quality that we're looking for, I think is a little misguided. Of course, we don't want to inflict unnecessary suffering and unnecessary pain, but there is, a property of pain and suffering that we need to have to be able to, first of all, have empathy and also to avoid hurting ourselves, actually. So I just want to add that aspect of pain.
Yeah, so with respect to that, yeah, I'm familiar with CIP where some people appear not to have the sensation of physical pain, but I believe with those people, they still experience emotional pain. And then the other thing I would say is, to be honest with you, yes, I do have a son, and I love him very much, and I wish he will have a very long, happy life. But I personally was not so sure I wanted to have a child exactly because the current world doesn't appear to be one which is going in a direction of maximum happiness. So it was something that I was very seriously concerned about. Yes, I think when most of us have children, I actually don't think it's based on a moral decision. I think it's something that we want to do for ourselves. And that's perfectly okay. We're all human in the end. But as long as we're talking about morality and what's good or right for the world, then I think many of us should be considering whether or not it makes sense to bring in entities that could be suffering a lot in the future.
Thanks for your talk. I always like seeing your talks. My question was originally what does the body do past computation? You say AI, that AI can never do what the body can do, and that's almost identical to the question that this student asked, and it's in a similar vein to what Dr. Long asked. And so I wanted to maintain it if you have a slightly different answer, but also extend it to, in part of your answer to the student, you said that if we knew the mechanism of subjective experience, then perhaps we could implement it in AI, and then AI could have consciousness. And so you led your talk with AI can never, ever be conscious. And so I was wondering if you could expand on your answer a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I want to be very clear. When I say AI can never be conscious, I really mean digital AI. And when I mean digital, I mean things that are basically executing computation, right? That are pure, for which we mostly believe their main action and activity is information processing, right? My main claim at the heart of all of this is that we can't assume that consciousness comes out of information processing. So these are the caveats, okay? Based on what we now, in some future age, there are lots of people who are working on all kinds of technologies for computation. We might have a quantum computer, and it might turn out that some quantum mechanism is actually the underlying reason for subjective experience, and it might turn out that quantum computers, which I would argue are not today's digital computers, can have some emotional experience or subjective experience. And then, as you were saying, what is it that human bodies can do that computers cannot do? We can bleed. We can, we can feel hot and cold as not just numbers, but as sensations. We can see the color blue We can, feel cold. We can feel, we can swim in water. All of these things, which if you're just talking about information processing, computers cannot do. Now, if you add computers with robots, then more of those things can be done, but not all of them, right? And I would argue in our brain, a whole bunch of things that are happening that computers are not even close to doing. Some people study like immunobiology, and one thing that looks like modern science is understanding is just how incredibly rich and complicated those systems are. I mean, I don't really believe this, but it's possible that your immune system is actually the thing that's conscious, right? So there's a whole lot that's happening physically with our biological bodies. I don't think that actual biology itself is necessarily necessary for consciousness, but something about it that we don't yet understand could be.
Thank you very much for your talk. I just maybe want to clarify one thing and to see how you think about this. So what I take from the computer chip example here, where you make your argument that digital computers can never be conscious, I feel like that's is sort of along the line that, okay, so computer is only doing like some kind of computations, and computation, it's not obvious why computations can lead to consciousness. Where at the same time, all those theories, the correlates that all those theories claim, for example, world modeling, self-reflection, like perceptual reality monitoring, things like that, those are functions that seems to be obvious that can arise from computations, but it's not obvious why those functions are linked to consciousness. I definitely agree, and I think this is just a manifestation of hard problem, but I don't see why that would refuse the possibility that computations can actually lead to consciousness, because computational functionalism, that's exactly what computational functionalism try to claim, right? So I feel like that argument itself doesn't really reject computational functionalism, just to demonstrate that this is computational functionalism does not really answer the hard problem, which I do agree, but at the same time, consciousness science, and not just consciousness science, but also physics, often progress with that kind of anti-realism inside, where we don't really assume that our position is right, but at the same time, we can also do a lot of fun experiments that can tell us more about at least the correlates of consciousness. And especially, for example, you may even be able to manipulate certain aspects of humans' neural computation and to see how that impacts your conscious experience. I feel like that's still very much a fruitful progress along the line where computational functionalism is assumed but not taken for granted to answer the hard problem. So I wonder, how do you think about that, and whether that would this line of thinking would actually makes your concern less prominent on this line of research?
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything you just said. I guess if I were to reduce this aspect of what I'm trying to say to one sentence, it would be that if you're going to assume computational functionalism, then you cannot claim that you have solved the question of how consciousness arises for people who don't already believe computational functionalism, which is some number of people, including people who think about consciousness, right? So that's really what I would say. You may solve it for people who believe computational functionalism, great, but that doesn't mean that you've definitively made the case for how consciousness arises.
Much.
Hello. Thanks so much for your talk. It was wonderful. I had two sort of questions, objections, and the first one was about your first slide about the robot. And I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea that we have a tendency to anthropomorphize things, and we have a pretty well characterized theory of mind network in our brains that is really good at identifying whether the entity we're talking to is a person or not, or and it can be overactive, right? So we can see bears and bushes and maybe non-real entities, but it works. And in the Blake Lemoine case, maybe it was a case of an overactive theory of mind network. But isn't this, but isn't the appropriate reaction, if there's so many confounds to this perception of personhood, isn't computational functionalism just the best? So, defined this way, of we rely less on model self-report, we rely less on LLM behavior, and we rely more on theory. Just sort of as a first pass, we could use structural similarity to our own brains with LLM structural architecture design. And that might be a good first pass. That might be a more promising road, because again, there's so many confounds, and just our ability to detect other minds. So we just have to do away with that entirely, right? So like, yeah, what do you say to that as just like, you know, the only option we have, or at least the best option we have, is to compare architectures, like cognitive architectures, instead of, yeah, like, you know, models will self-report certain things, and that may not be accurate, and if you're only going by that, as Blake Lemoine did, you're probably going to be led astray. But maybe it's a better method to use theory instead of, and yeah, what do you have?
I mean, so first of all, I want to make sure that I'm not suggesting that we should stop trying to understand consciousness. I think that that's worthwhile and super interesting, and you know, I believe that you know, we should come at it from multiple different directions. As to, yeah, I don't fundamentally disagree, I think, with what you're saying, which is, yeah, if you happen to believe that computation of some sort gets you a good chunk of consciousness, if not the whole thing, then it still would seem worthy of investigation. I will personally remain skeptical that you've solved the hard problem that way, but I think you can learn a lot. Again, I do think a lot of the models that are proposed so far are getting us towards solving, you know, some of the easy problems. Again, easy just in quotes. I still think they're ridiculously complicated and hard, but compared to the hard problem, they do seem relatively easy.
One more point was with one of your analogies, which is it's a pretty often cited case of, you know, you asked whether computing gravity produces heaviness. And there's like similar versions of this, you know, simulating a storm doesn't produce wetness and so on. But I guess the issue with this is an issue of like different environments, right? So in a physics engine, in an artificial environment, you can produce gravity for agents that are embedded in that environment, right? So from the perspective of that agent, you have a thing like gravity that, you know, if you plug in some standard model stuff, you could probably simulate pretty well. And so it produces a different kind of heaviness that globally affects whatever agent's embedded in that system. And I just see the claim that, like, yeah, it doesn't produce wetness, but we're not embedded in that environment. So
right, I think you're getting at this very interesting distinction between things in which the model captures the essence of the thing that you're modeling, and things and phenomena where you can model the heck out of it, and maybe you can predict a whole bunch of things, but you never actually get the phenomena through modeling. And I think those are two very distinct camps. And within the same simulation, you have both aspects of it, right? Like some aspects, the simulation does reveal everything you want to know about it. In other contexts, the phenomena just doesn't get duplicated, like gravity.
If an agent with tactile sensors in that environment, and it can.
That's true, and then
yeah.
you have to prove. Now you have to prove to me that that agent has some subjective experience that we should take seriously. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Toyama, again. So I'm just going to say one word. We have come full circle, I think. We started with clinical neuroscience, went to basic neuroscience, to computation, to philosophy. I think it was better than Tucson, because rarely we have such a combination of different views and presented by different experts. Instead of focused, now we have a whole spectrum. And so for that, I'm grateful to the presenters who took their time to come here to Ann Arbor and present their very best. And it was wonderful. I thank the audience as well for being here. And I thank special thanks to Kathy Zelena, who actually organized the entire event, as well as to Don Sealer and Tara Stevenson and Kate Malik, who all helped to run the entire event smoothly. So thank you very much, and all the best.